You're listening to Speaking Side Mount, the podcast where we talk all things side mount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and side mount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top side mount divers. Whether you're new to side mount, been side mount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things side mount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet.
Hey, welcome back to Speaking Side Mount. I'm Steve Davis. This premium patron-only episode is produced with the support of XDeep and the patrons of Speaking Side Mount. Thanks so much to all of you for your enduring support. It makes all of this possible. Well, it's been a really busy time for us here in New Zealand. We're in the very fortunate situation of having our internal economy fully open with zero restrictions based on no cases of COVID-19 outside of our border quarantine facilities. It really is a very strange and challenging time to see the pandemic still raging around the world. To all of you in countries still battling the virus, my best wishes, and I hope that we can get back to some sense of normality as soon as possible and go for a dive together. Now, I first got into side mount diving after watching the YouTube video of Steve Bogart's skills demonstration at Ponderosa Cenote in Yucatan, Mexico. It was so compelling to see diving at that level, and Steve, without doubt, has been one of the modern-day pioneers and played a leading role in the massive growth that side mount diving has experienced over the past 10 years. When I started Speaking Side Mount, Steve was right at the top of my list as an interview guest, and I remember reaching out to him with some trepidation, wondering whether he'd be interested in supporting a podcast hosted by someone he'd never met, nor I suspect heard of. To my great pleasure, he accepted the invitation, and although the conversation was a little staid at first, to say the least, we soon warmed to it, and I was able to effectively launch this podcast with two great interviews with Steve. It set the standard and laid the platform for everything that followed. Now, over the past 2 years, Steve has had it pretty tough with respect to diving. A series of DCS incidents on successive dives, each a little worse than the previous, has led Steve to hang up his fins and retire from diving. Just the thought of one of the world's great cave explorers having to quit under circumstances like this is just gut-wrenching. But to his credit, Steve has continued to be active and regularly shares enlightening posts on various topics related to side mount, cave diving, and exploration. He still has a huge amount to share, and over the next 2 episodes, I catch up with Steve and discuss a myriad of side mount, cave diving, exploration, and dive-related topics. The first episode, number 56, is a patron-only premium episode. Steve and I discuss the importance of building skills, confidence, and experience. We talk about dealing with fear in diving and then go into how to react when things go wrong. And then we tie all of this together and talk about the amazing dives he did with Brian Caycook to connect Dan and Ralph's Caves in Abaco, Bahamas. You will have heard Brian talk about this in his last episode we did together, and it is a stellar story of achievement along with dealing with multiple incidents while passing a no visibility, no mount, clay and mud-filled vertical restriction. You won't want to miss it. Now, in the next episode, number 57, Steve and I discuss his DCS incidents, what he's learned about them, his thoughts on the possible causes, and his plans for the future. Again, my huge thanks to XDeep and all of the patrons of Speaking Side Mount, and thanks to Steve Bogarts for sharing with all of us.
And one of the things I've enjoyed over the last few months is that you've kind of stayed engaged through Facebook and you've been making various posts. Some of them a little historic in terms of, I think, repeating posts you've done before, but you've been bringing up topics, things like dive incidents and how mental toughness and the mental side of diving is really important. We've gone for nearly an hour already. Have you got some more time and we can dig into some of those?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so one that really sort of jumps out to me is really dive incidents, and whether you call it mistakes, cock-ups, scares, close calls, or whatever you want to call it, when you get yourself into a situation where obviously in trouble and things going wrong, and no one is immune from making mistakes. We all know that. Doesn't matter what your skills, what your experience is, the more dives you do, the greater the chance that you're going to have a gear failure. And as you start to push you and grow your confidence level, the greater the opportunity that you're going to get yourself in a situation where, let's call it challenging, but it could be life-threatening. I think we've both been involved in Stratus Casa's book, Close Calls, where we've recounted some stories. I don't want to scoop the book by any means, but can you give us your thoughts on what you've learned over the years in terms of dealing with close calls?
What I basically learned is the instance that I was able to deal with comfortably later in my diving career would have definitely had a different outcome, maybe a fatal outcome early in my diving career. And the only difference is my experience level and comfort level between where I started out and where I ended up. And one of the issues that's always been present in diving, maybe a little bit more prevalent now than it used to be, because there's so much access to information, to training, to equipment and everything else, is that some people are trying to move too fast. So they're trying to do too much too soon. They read about, amazing dives that people are doing around the world, and they want to emulate those dives. And what they don't realize is all the hard work, all the time, all the effort, all the experience, all the years of practice that has gone into making those dives a reality. So they just see the final accomplishment, the thing that gets sort of like talked about, that gets lauded, but they don't see all the little details that go into making that dive possible, successful, and at the same time safe. They just think, okay, well, I see this person doing that, I want to do it, and they want to do it as quickly as possible. They set that as their goal. So in 1 year, I want to be diving 10,000 feet back in a cave using a scooter and rebreather or whatever else it is. And obviously these days, because there is so much more accessibility to training, to information, to equipment, it is possible to fast track your way through all of this stuff. But the one thing that is impossible to fast track your way through is incremental gains in experience. And that just takes time. It takes dives. It takes years and years of actually going out, going diving, and experiencing both the things that go well and the things that don't go so well. So throughout my diving career, I've made mistakes, I've made errors, I've had situations which were at the limits of my ability to cope with at that particular point in my diving career. Now, as I gained greater experience, as I became a better, more knowledgeable, more competent diver, then my comfort zone, that bubble that surrounds me, expanded and allowed me to do more challenging, more extreme dives. So the risks are potentially higher when you're doing those type of dives in that type of environment. And when things go wrong, all that experience that you have behind you is what keeps you safe, what allows you to be able to deal with the problems and the issues and everything else. And if you don't have that experience, 99 times out of 100, your dives are going to go well, you're not going to have a problem. And that gives you a false sense of security, because the one time it does go wrong is the time that you're going to need that large bank of experience that you've been paying into small amounts over a very, very long period of time. And now you have to come and take a big withdrawal, and you discover, I don't actually have that amount of experience in my bank to withdraw from. And that's when things go badly wrong very, very quickly. So my caution to people is, it's good to have goals, but realize that the journey is more important than the destination. And you really need to build up your experience, consolidate your skills, consolidate all the things you've been taught at every level of training before just jumping through to the next level of training. As I said, the last 10 years of my diving career, I used scooters a lot more than I did sort of like the previous time during my diving career. But all the dives that I did with the scooters, I could have done them swimming. Also, I was very clear about my ability, if my scooter failed, that I would be swimming out as well. So those tools made the diving easier, made it logistically easier, made it physically easier and everything else. But they weren't a substitute for skills, experience, or physical capability. And I think nowadays, sometimes people are using equipment to patch flaws or to cover flaws in their technique, their experience levels and everything else. So if you look at another aspect of technology, which is rebreathers are a great tool that can allow you to do amazing dives that would be a lot more difficult to do open circuit. But way too many people are getting into rebreather diving because of flaws they have themselves in their own personal diving technique. And they really need to address those before they use a piece of equipment to cover for those flaws. Because if they have a failure with that piece of equipment, and now they have to revert back to open circuit, bailout, or whatever else, then those flaws are not only going to come back, but they're going to come back tenfold because they haven't been practicing those skills.
Yeah. What sort of flaws are you talking about there?
Okay, so one thing that's very clear is I hear a lot of people saying, I've decided to start diving rebreathers because my gas consumption is really poor.
Yeah.
And I can't get anywhere open circuit. So now I've decided to dive a rebreather so I can go deeper or I can go further back into the cave. That is a horrible, horrible reason for using a rebreather. If you do have very poor gas consumption, then you need to address that issue. And only when you've addressed that issue should you even think about using a rebreather. Because if your rebreather fails, you're back on open circuit, and all of those problems and flaws that you had are going to come back and bite you in the arse in an extreme situation where you're under stress.
Stressed, yeah.
Using skills that you haven't practiced for a long time because you haven't been diving open circuit. It is not going to get better. Typically, when people have poor gas consumption, it is because they're having issues with their buoyancy, with their trim, with their propulsion techniques, with their fitness levels, perhaps. And those are all things that can be addressed and can be corrected. But saying, okay, I have poor gas consumption, horrible. And, I've seen this many times where I look at a diver and they tell me, yeah, my gas consumption is really bad. And I'm looking at them, I'm thinking, yeah, I can see why. Because, you look very uncomfortable in the water. Your buoyancy's off, your trim's off. You're working way harder than you should be. You're moving constantly, and maybe you're unfit as well. So let's correct all of those things rather than think, okay, I'm going to start using a rebreather at this point in time. Because you put a person like that in a rebreather, you haven't addressed any of those issues. And to be honest, rebreathers are a little bit more challenging to dive in many ways than open circuit, which is quite forgiving. So you may have even made the situation slightly worse. Their buoyancy doesn't get better, their trim doesn't get better, their fitness levels aren't improving. So they're just now able to take their poor skills further into the cave or deeper, which is a recipe for disaster. I mean, unfortunately, I see it in the cave a lot where the amount of damage that you see in cave from diver traffic has increased a lot as the tools have got better. So you've got people with poorer skills who are able to go further into the cave because they're using a scooter or because they're using a rebreather. They don't have the skills to match the equipment they're using or to match where they're getting to. And the environment's suffering, which is terrible. But worst case scenario, if they do have an issue, they're going to die. And we've seen this quite a few times where people are diving beyond their experience level. Forget about certification level. I mean, certification, is nothing more than sort of like an acknowledgement of completing a level of training. It doesn't really tell you about someone's experience level. It doesn't even tell you whether someone's a good diver or not. I mean, I've had lots of people turn up and show me a certification card, and their diving skills do not match that certification, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So certifications are not that important. What's important is that people's skills are matched to the environment they're diving in, with the tools that they're diving, and also the type of dive they're doing as well. So, there's a lot of people these days that have just progressed, too far, too fast, with too many fancy new toys and tools. And they need to slow down a bit, and they need to consolidate their skills at each level, and they need to make sure they're really ready for the tools that they're diving and also the type of diving they do. Because they're putting themselves in danger, they're putting their dive buddies in danger, and they're doing damage in the environment as well, which is sad to see. I hate to see rebreather divers kneeling on the bottom or upright, kicking everything. These are skills that should have been addressed much, much earlier in their diver education. And so this is another point that I think sometimes we miss as well as instructors, as trainers and everything else. What are the most important skills that we teach the divers? And for my mind, those fundamental skills, the platform that create the solid foundation for everything else we do is buoyancy control, trim, propulsion technique, positioning and awareness. Those are the foundation for everything else we do. And that's where the main focus of all our training should be. And every time you move up to a higher level of training, or you use a new piece of equipment, or you're in a new environment, you need to go back to those fundamental skills, those foundation skills, and you need to readdress them because it changes from environment to environment and from piece of equipment to...
That is such wise advice, and I'll give you my personal experience with that. Right from the very beginning for me, which was I told you last time, seeing the Yanni video, right? And seeing you there doing the skills demonstration, I thought, wow, I have never seen diving like that before in my life. I want to be like that. And I remember talking to Patrick Woodman, and he said, oh, yeah, it's like picking up a Wilson tennis racket and saying you're going to be Roger Federer. But it was an amazing example of what could be done. And I thought, okay, that's what I want to do. So I went to Mexico, did my cave training, went to Gozo, trained with Tom Steiner. And open circuit wise, I actually got to a level where I think I could replicate most of the skills that you were doing there in open circuit. And so, but that took me many years. That would have taken 5 or 6 years to get to a point where I was even close to approaching that. and I felt extremely comfortable. And now I've just been training with Ed Sorensen on the KISS Sidewinder, did a good job with Ed. He got some great training from him. He and I then went and did some amazing dives together where I felt as if I achieved a really good level. But now I'm taking that equipment to a different environment. So I've gone from caves and freshwater, and I'm going into saltwater environments. I'm diving off boats. And what I'm finding is I'm starting to struggle. And so what I've been working on is exactly what you're talking about, is reestablishing my platform again and making sure that, number one, I've got my equipment squared away. Number two, I've got my platform, my buoyancy, my trim, and my balance sorted out. And there's things that I've needed to do with the equipment. I'm finding it, like most rebreather divers, I'm really struggling at shallow depths at the moment. And half the time I don't know what's going wrong. So I need to learn that. But I'm not ready to go on. The next level for me is CCR cave, and I want to do normoxic trimix on it. But, I'm about 40 hours in maybe now, but they've been sporadic because of COVID. I need to put a lot more on that to reestablish that platform that I had in open circuit, so that I can then say, okay, I have this now on the Sidewinder. I'm ready to go on to whatever the next levels are. So that is such good advice for anyone listening. If you don't have it in open circuit, get it there first. If you do go to a rebreather, make sure you replicate that platform, because it's important to everything you do, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you touched on a few key points here, which is one, awareness. It's awareness of the fact that my skill level is here in a specific equipment configuration at a specific environment. If I change the environment and if I change the equipment, then my skill level just dropped and my experience level dropped as well. So I need to bring both my experience level and my skill level back up. The other thing is awareness of where the bar is or what the possibilities are. Now, as you said, when you looked at the Yanni video, the skills video from open water in Ponderosa in Sidemount, there's nothing special about me as a person or as a diver or anything else. It's just years of practice, because I did it a lot, many, many years. And it would be a little bit sad if I didn't become a good diver, considering the amount that I dived. But a lot of people, perhaps a point in their diving career, but they don't even know what good diving actually is. They haven't been exposed to good buoyancy control, good trim, good propulsion techniques. They don't even know that exists. So you said yourself, you looked at that video and you're like, okay, that's where I want to be. And you got there because you realized that's a possibility. You can achieve that. And through hard work and going diving, you did. And I would say it's the same for everything. All of those skills, they can all be taught. All they need is a little bit of awareness of what the skill is and how to do it. And then just practice and repetition until you master them. And that's what mastery is. It's just like constant repetition of a skill until you actually have it sort of like down to the point where you can do it almost reflexively or innately. So, those videos perhaps exposed people to a level of diving that they hadn't been exposed to before and gave them something to shoot for, to aim for. But everyone can achieve that, absolutely, 100%. But just because you achieve that in one area, which is like open circuit side mount, for example, now if you switch to different configuration, even if it's open circuit back mount, it changes. You need to build those skill levels back up. That will probably be faster because there's more crossover than if you go all of a sudden to closed circuit. Now a lot of things change. So, but you can get to that same level, closed circuit as well. And to be honest, that's what you should be aiming for, to get to that level or even exceed that level. Because when you get really good on closed circuit, you realize that it's actually easier in many ways to control your buoyancy and your trim, because things aren't changing as much. With open circuit, things change with every single breath you take. With closed circuit, they don't, because of the nature of the closed loop. So initially, maybe it's a little bit harder to master some of those skills, but you should get to the point where you're actually able to hold your position in the water, closed circuit, with more control and more stability than you can open circuit. But like anything else, it requires time, it requires practice. When we talk about environment, in many ways, the cave environment is the easiest environment to dive in. So although there are some inherent hazards and dangers of diving in a cave environment that you don't have in the open water, the one thing that the cave has that the open water doesn't so much is stability. Nothing too much changes during the dive for the most part. So there are tidal caves and everything else, or caves that have high flow, and so you need to have the knowledge, the techniques, the tricks to be able to dive in those comfortably. But in the open water, you're dealing with a much more free-form environment. So you've got to deal with surf and surge and currents, and the fact that you don't have a ceiling over your head, which is going to catch you if you screw up your buoyancy or something. You don't have as many visual references to be able to hold your depth and everything. So I would actually argue that diving a rebreather in the open water is more difficult in many ways than diving a rebreather in a cave environment, where you have a lot more visual clues, you have a more stable environment. Depth makes a difference. So if you're shallow in the open water or shallow in the cave, it does make it slightly more challenging to use a rebreather. But again, with extra knowledge, you learn extra tips and tricks about how to do that effectively, such as lowering your set point, for example. So there's less change in PO2, particularly when you're in shallow water and you're making small ascents and descents, such as using a diluent gas that matches your PO2 at your target operating depth. So again, if you're venting loop volume and then putting diluent back in, you're not disturbing the PO2 in the loop, so you get off that roller coaster that you can be on otherwise. So there's definitely ways to minimize the changes that are going on in the rebreather in shallow water that upset your equilibrium, upset the loop volume, upset the PO2 in the loop, and cause buoyancy issues and everything else. So it's knowledge-based, it's skills-based, it's practice-based, but different environments do require definitely different skill sets and different levels of practice. And regard cave diving as the pinnacle of diving in the fact that it's an environment that gives you so much feedback, because you're in a three-dimensional environment, and whatever you do, if you make any mistakes, the cave lets you know. You can get away with a lot more in the open water without getting instant feedback from it. You're not touching the line or touching the ceiling, the floor, the walls of the cave. You're not disturbing silt. You're not perhaps bumping into something, which happens in the cave. So that gives you that immediate feedback that allows you to improve, refine your skills. But the open water requires a different skill set. And I think in many ways it's just as challenging as a cave diving skill set, because that ability to hover neutrally buoyant and hold your depth in blue water with no visual references, perhaps when there's surf or surge or where there's currents going on, is quite challenging, and more so on a rebreather than with open circuit. So yeah, those are all skills that need to be practiced.
Yeah.
Often, if you take a cave diver out of his comfort zone and you put him in the ocean, it looks horrible.
Yeah.
You know, I came from an ocean diving background and got into cave diving, and all the time I've been cave diving, I've also been ocean diving as well. But there are cave divers out there who don't do anything but cave diving.
Yes.
And you take them out of the cave, you put them in the ocean, you're just like, this guy's a cave diver? Really?
Yeah.
I mean, they look great in the cave. You put them in the ocean, you think, oh my God, this guy's a discovered scuba diver.
Now, it is really interesting. I think the things, from my training, if I reflect on that, I mean, the thing that I enjoyed the most is, Ed and I would load up the truck, take our gear down to Jackson Blue. We'd gear up on a couple of park benches. We'd walk 50 meters down to a very easy ladder where we'd placed our cylinders. We put our cylinders on, standing in waist deep water, did all our pre-dive checks. We submerged, we swam through a little gut and then down into the cave and into a little bit of flow. But it's all very, very easy. And I contrast that to what I'm trying to achieve now, where I'm on a boat. I'm sitting there in a very small dive deck with another 5 or 6 other rebreather divers. They're diving APs or something, so they've got these big units. And then trying to figure out, well, is there a way I can don this in the water? Well, not really. I need to have everything on before I get in the water, because we're in water deeper than we can stand in, and we need to be ready to go because there's waves and current and so on. So it's a way different proposition. But I'm enjoying the process of learning that, because, that's why I did it. I went to rebreather diving because I'd got to a level in open circuit where I thought, well, this is kind of easy. I'm ready for the next step now. And so learning something new and challenging yourself that way is really awesome, and I'm enjoying it. But at the same time, it's super frustrating sometimes, for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. You think, oh, I'm a good diver, I can handle this. And all of a sudden, the environment doing something different, you're just like, oh my God, that's way harder than it should be. And I'm just embarrassing myself. But I think one of the big differences between cave diving and ocean diving, particularly, going off a boat and everything else, is time pressure.
Yes.
There's no time pressure in cave diving, or there shouldn't be any time pressure in cave diving. Whereas when you're ocean diving, you're looking for slack windows, that you've got to deal with the fact that the boat's only going to sit around for a certain length of time waiting for you to get ready, and they're probably trying to drop you in at a specific point. Everyone's got to go together. So it's a lot about procedure and protocol and making sure that you've done all the things that you can do prior to the point where you're going to hit the water, so that you're comfortable and you're not under stress and you're not under time pressure. But yeah, for sure, you maybe have to change equipment, you have to change protocol, you have to change procedure. The key for me in all the diving I've ever done is to make it as easy as possible for myself. Because if it's easy, then it's less stressful. And one of the ways of making it easy for myself is to, as much as possible, take away the time pressure. So that means prior preparation and planning prevent a piss poor performance. So as much as you can do prior to splashing, prior to rolling off the side of the boat, to get yourself sorted out. So that means doing your setup of the rebreather and all your pre-dive checks before you even get on the boat. Now, obviously, once you're on, you're probably going to want to repeat those, but you know you've already done most of it, rather than you discover like 15 minutes before you're about to hit the water that your rebreather's failing all its pre-dive checks. Now you've got to dismantle it on a rocking boat with a whole bunch of other people sitting around going, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. You're just setting yourself up for failure. And what you want to do is you want to plan for success rather than have no plan whatsoever. And the chances are it's all going to go badly.
Yeah, one other thing I've learned is really there's ways to simplify your equipment as well. That's a really good path to go down. The way that you donned off, what you're wearing. And I've been doing quite a bit with that. I've been talking to Pete Mesley quite a bit, who I know you know as well, who's a big-time rebreather diver here. He doesn't know my unit very well, but he's been giving me lots of really, really good pointers and even ideas, which I don't think anyone else in the world is diving a sidewinder the way that he's suggesting that I do. But there's still merit in what he's saying. So I'm going through that in my mind, and it's all about equipment simplification. It doesn't mean take the same equipment configuration onto trimix dives and so on, or even to cave dives. But what it means is for what I'm doing right now, make it really simple so you can bed in the level that you're at and then be ready to move on to the next level. And if that involves another configuration change, well, you're now ready for that. Yeah, it's been really good talking to him about it. And, I was fortunate enough to be supervisor on a 100-meter course that he just ran, and just watching the way that guy operates in terms of what you said about safety, process, procedure. Here's how we're going to run things. Here's what happens when things go wrong. And then just watching them conduct the dives, it took me back to Gozo with the amount of precision that they had. When they said an S&B was coming up on the run time at minute 55, it came up at minute 54 or 55. It was right on the button and everything they did. It was amazing to watch and great to be part of for that reason.
My mantras all through my diving career has always been KISS, keep it simple, and less is more. The less you have to take with you, the less things you have to worry about, the easier your life becomes.
Yeah, really good. Just onto a new subject, which maybe ties some of this together. I interviewed Brian Kaycock back 2 episodes ago, and we were talking a little bit about the diving that you and he were doing together in Dan's Cave, and I think it was the connection to Ralph's Cave you were trying to make. And I think it ties together some of these topics of, number one, exploration diving, number two, when things are tough and things go wrong. You mentioned the amazing dives you did at the end there to connect Dan and Ralph's Cave, and I'll use his words. I'm looking over at a screen because I've got them written here. He said, Steve went through this just ridiculously stupid, mud-filled, clay-filled restriction, and he found my line on the other side. And he alluded that there was a lot more to that story, but he wasn't prepared to tell me, and he told me I had to ask you personally. So can you share that dive that you did to connect the two cave systems together, which was fundamental in the exploration that Brian's doing now?
Sure. As you say, it does tie things together because it's a little bit about experience. I would not have gone through that restriction early on in my diving career. I mean, it just would have been horrifying, the idea of actually going through this thing, because I was a long, long way back in a cave after several stages to get me to where I'm going. And now I've got to no mount through an extremely small, extremely challenging restriction. I have no idea what's on the other side of it, whether I'm going to be able to turn around, if I'm going to be able to back up. I've got to go down this thing, which is at like a pretty steep angle, so 45-degree angle, head first, basically plowing through thick clay to get down it. So it's the type of thing where you build up to those type of dives, you build up to doing things like that. And even then, even with the experience that you have, even with the knowledge you have, you're fully aware that things can still go wrong. But the key is being able to stay calm in potentially stressful situations. So actually going down this sort of like clay chute, that was fine. That wasn't a problem. That went off without incident. It was tough. It was challenging. I mean, I literally had to physically force myself down through this restriction, literally plowing through the clay as I was going, pushing off the ceiling with my heels in zero visibility while running a line. And I popped out at the bottom end of it. And I was very, very careful about how I was running the line, where I was running the line, and making my tie-offs and everything else on the way down, because I was fully aware of the fact that I could easily line trap myself on my return if I wasn't really, really careful about the placement of the line and the placement of my body relative to the line and everything else. But as I got to the bottom of this restriction, which was actually fairly long as well, and made my tie-off, and actually finding tie-offs was fairly challenging, but super important to have the tie-off secure and in the right place as well. At that point, the cave opened back up. I sort of had to go down through this restriction. It opened up a little bit, which is typical of the caves in the Bahamas, which is these large rooms connected by these deep, almost like drains, which tend to be fairly restricted and very often do have these clay floors. So as I came into this large room, I'm looking around. I take the most obvious lead. I swim over through the room, over to the far side, drop down, carry on going, go through another restriction, and found a line that was actually coming from the other side, one of Brian's lines, and connected that. And that's what made the connection. Turning around to go back, now I've got to go back up this clay chute that I've come down. Obviously, this area of the cave is in zero visibility for my passage through on the way in. But I have a clear mental picture of where I need to be, where I need to go, and everything else. So I'm holding the line in my right hand, and I'm moving carefully back up the slope. And it's slightly more challenging going up than it is going down. It's a little bit more difficult to push against the ceiling. And it felt like I was just sort of like a bar slope being sort of like squidged through, like along the floor. And as I'm going up, I realized I positioned myself slightly wrong, and I'm too far over to the side, and I can't actually go further up. So then I tried to back up. It was impossible to back up. So I think to myself, okay, I have to move over to a little bit close to the line. I've got the line, I'm holding it in my right hand. I'm on the left-hand side of the line, and I've got my head turned to the left as well. And the mistake I made was I thought I have to go this way. So I turned my head to the right-hand side to look in the direction I wanted to go. And as I did that, I basically scooped my second stage through the clay. Because, the reason I had my head turned to the side is because I could only fit with my head turned to the side. And as I turned my head, I scooped my second stage through the clay, and the entire second stage completely filled up with clay, like an ice cream scoop. So I turned my head to the side, and I went to take a breath, and nothing happened. I'm like, great. So at that point, my other hand is here. But I physically, because it's too small, I can't reach my other second stage. I have a necklace around my neck.
It's your left side regulator?
Basically, I've got two short hoses. One's on a necklace and one's clipped off the necklace.
Okay,
so while I'm going up this thing, I've got this one pulled to the side. So before I go in, I've already know that I'm like, I have to go up like this, and I have this one pulled to the side. As I went through, I scoop up the clay. Yeah, nothing's happened. I cannot use this hand to take this second stage because I can't physically get it underneath me. So I have to take my hand off the line. Remember, I'm in zero visibility at this point in time, but that's not really an issue. At this point, I'm stuck. I can't go further forward. I can't go further back. I just turn my head to the side. Now I have nothing to breathe, but I know that I've got this second stage here. So I'm able to take my hand off the line. I get this second stage. I put it in my mouth. And as I do, it starts free flowing. And I put my hand back on the line. So now I'm stuck in zero visibility. I've got my hand on the line. One second stage is completely clogged and the other one is free flowing at this point. Not super bad, but it's like, great. So then I sort of like scooch over close to the line, and then I'm able to actually move up a little bit, but it's slow going. And as I'm going up, this one is now not only free flowing, but it's getting clogged with clay and it's starting to wet breathe as well. And I'm like, oh, shit, this is not much fun. But I know not too far in front of me, I have a stage bowl. So I'd actually found this restriction the day before. And at that point, I'd looked at it and thought, yeah, that looks pretty horrible. Let's see if I can find a way around it. And I'd looked for an alternative lead, which actually didn't pan out. So at that point, I knew, okay, I'm going to push that restriction. So I carried a stage bottle all the way to that restriction. I'd left it just the other side of the restriction, because I knew the chances were that I might be stuck in it for a long period of time, either going in or coming out. And so it would be nice, just so that I have gas there should I need it. So it's slow going up this slope. I'm literally going like inch by inch. The breathing on the regulator I got in my mouth is getting worse and worse. There's no way that I can at this point take it out, shake it out, clear it out or anything else. But I carry on going and I eventually make it up the slope and I get to the stage bottle. The regulator was still just working, but I mean really just working. So I was getting more water than I was air with each breath. But again, I was comfortable because I practiced being in zero visibility a lot. I practiced dealing with a regulator that is really giving me lots of problems. One of the things I used to do during advanced side mount classes was I'd have what was known as a regulator of death. And that was a regulator that free flowed, that wet breathed, that was difficult to use. And so I was used to using that. So again, my comfort level in this situation, which is definitely extreme, stuck in zero visibility with one clog regulator and one malfunctioning regulator, is not the best place to be. It's challenging, but I was able to maintain my mental faculties. I was calm. All the movements I was making were controlled. I already knew I'd made one mistake. My mistake was basically turning my head to the side and scooping up the clay. So at that point, I thought, yeah, that was dumb. You shouldn't have done that. You should have been thinking. And I thought, okay, you've made your mistake for the day. No more mistakes. So at this point, everything has to be absolutely on point. And even though I was dealing with some challenges, it was never hugely stressful for me. I was comfortable in the fact that, yeah, I can get up here. Eventually, this restriction is going to open up. I'm going to have a bit of space. I can address my regulator. And once I got up to the top of the slope, I was able to take the regulator out, shake it out, and there was some shit poured in the exhaust tee, and there was some stuff inside the exhaust as well. So once I cleared it, then it was breathing a lot better. It still had a bit of clay in it. The other one I couldn't actually clear at all. It was just too jam-packed full of clay. But I knew, like 50 feet away, there's my stage bottle. So I just carried on going while I'm trying to get this one working again. Got to my stage bottle and switched to my stage at that point because that was the easy solution. While I carried on as I'm swimming out, just working on the other regulator to get it back to a more functional state, which I was able to do. The other regulator I actually had to take back to Brian's shop and completely dismantle it, strip it down and clear all this clay out. And it was literally like modeling clay. It was like someone had jam-packed my second stage with modeling clay, and it was just impossible to clear out effectively underwater in that situation. I just had to say, okay, that was done. It's gone. I just have to deal with the situation and move on. It was an interesting experience, but it was something that to a certain extent that I had planned for. I knew that this restriction could definitely cause me problems, which is why I had the stage bottle really close by, which is why I thought really carefully about line placement, tie-offs and everything else, which is also why I thought about my positioning relative to line, how I was going to approach it both on the way down, on the way back up again. The mistake I made was literally turning my head to the side, which in retrospect, it was a dumb thing to do. But, it just was a natural or instinctive reaction. Oh, I'm going this way. I'll turn my head towards the direction I want to go in.
Yeah.
So it also made me think afterwards about, okay, if I'm going to do that again or be in that situation again, I always want to have my head turned to the side of my backup regulator. So which regulator I breathe is going to depend on which way I want to have my head turned. And I always want to be facing my backup regulator. I don't ever want to be in a situation where my head is turned away from the regulator I may have to switch to if I'm in such a small, tight restriction.
Yeah.
After I'd made the connection, Brian went and had a look at the restriction. Just out of interest, he was able to verify the connection from the other side, and he went and had a look at the restriction and came back and he was just shaking his head and he went, no way, man. You're insane.
Yeah, exactly. Amazing story. And there's so much in there in terms of, number one, making the connection. Of course, that in itself is immense. And I've had some experience at the very beginner level of going down through a zero visibility restriction, vertically head down. And it's an interesting feeling doing that, especially the first time you go through something like that. And so I know, obviously the next time you're going to be a little better, and then coming back out of it, I found a really challenging experience as well. I did that in Australia in a cave called Engelbrechts, which is very narrow, muddy little entrance, vertically in, vertically out. But in order to be able to dive the caves there, we had to go through a thing called a stress test. So despite having already done cave training, in order to do what they call a crossover, you have to go through the stress test, and had the great privilege of doing it with JDZ, John Delazuana, overseeing us. And we had to lay a line basically inside a sinkhole and go around, just lay this line, go through a restriction, which was really a tree stump that had these branches going out. We passed through there. It was a one tank off through the restriction, go through the other side. Then it was masks off, gas sharing with your teammate, and then we had to do a gas sharing exit. But partway through the gas sharing exit, we had a second gas failure where we had to buddy breathe. And I hadn't buddy breathed since the 70s because that's what we used to do back then. But it was not a real world scenario, but it was exactly what we said. It's a stress test. So they had a technique for doing that, which I thought was really awesome. And we basically, with zero visibility, holding onto the line, we shared one regulator going out between two of us. And it was a really neat experience, and I was pleased to do it. And I think back to the training side, putting yourself through in a safe environment or a safe-ish environment, those sort of stressful situations, so that you know that mentally you can deal with it. And we had an incident going through the restriction on the way out where I was breathing my buddy's long hose who was behind me, and we got a kink in the hose. So every time I moved, I got no gas, and every time I backed up, I got gas again. And so we had to solve a problem on the way out as well. And so, as I said, it was such a good experience to do that. And I think the more we build that into our training, holds us in good stead if you do have to face a situation such as what you just described.
Yeah, I've always been a big believer in train hard, dive easy. So the idea is the training you should do when you're in a controlled, safe situation, where if something goes wrong, you can just end the drill and everyone's fine. But you make the training as challenging as possible. And that way, when it comes to diving, the diving should be easy by comparison. I think, though, that there's a couple of caveats to that. And one of those caveats is, let's not do any damage in the cave. So we can do these stress tests. We can do this training in the open water where it's actually safer for the participants, but you're also not doing damage to the cave as well. And the second thing is, as important as I think that type of training is, those stress tests are, and I think they are, and I think they really build up a high degree of comfort, or what I would call watermanship skills, I still think the fundamentals are even more important, because if you've got your fundamentals right, there's far less chance of you getting into a situation where you have to put your emergency skills into practice. So it's more a stitch in time saves nine. We should be practicing the skills that keep us out of trouble. Those are the ones that we should focus on most. And those are the ones that we should really make sure that they're absolutely solid. Do we need to practice the emergency skills and drills? Of course we do. But let's try not to put ourselves in that situation where we have to use them in the first place. And the next thing I would say is that, again, it comes down to experience. The more you do this type of stuff, the stress test, whatever else, the more you're in zero visibility or simulated zero visibility, the more comfortable you become. One of the great advantages I've had through my diving career is that I've been teaching all the time. So I'm actually, by nature of what I'm doing, because I'm doing it with my students, I'm doing it myself, I'm demonstrating these skills to them, I had to practice them, or I was exposed to them over and over and over again. So I spent so much time in zero visibility or simulated zero visibility. I spent so much time doing body breathing or basically various different types of stress tests, like demonstrating them to students, doing them with the students, being there while the students are doing them, supervising them. So that made me a much better diver, just because I was forced to do those things. Now, if I wasn't teaching as well as diving, would I have done so much of that practice and training? I don't think I would have. So I think that is also small deposits into the bank of experience over many, many, many years. So I think all cave divers really need to feel completely comfortable in zero visibility. But more than being comfortable in zero visibility, they still need to have good situational awareness. They need to have good buoyancy. They need to have good trim. They need to have good propulsion techniques, even though they're in zero visibility. And you can practice. Those are all skills. Swimming in a straight line in zero visibility, that's a skill that you can practice. I'm not suggesting you go in the cave and practice. You can do that just as easily in the open water, where you're completely safe and where you're not going to damage anything. But these are skills that you can and should practice to make you a better, more competent, safer, more comfortable cave diver.
That's a really good point. And I wonder how many people really do that. If you're not teaching diving, how many times you go out and, set up a line and put on a blackout mask or take your mask off and go around and practice some of those things that we learn on courses and that we get forced to do every now and again, doing crossovers.
Not as often as they should be.
Yeah, exactly. I remember one thing in Gozo, because we were a school there, it didn't matter what dive we did. We always came back to the 6-meter plateau and did skills at the end of every dive. And it had a double-edged benefit for us. I think, number one, you're always practicing the skills that you're teaching on courses or that are taught on courses. But number two, we had an extra 15 minutes or so at 6 meters, and Tom Steiner has a famous saying, which is always Tom's thing, it's one decompression dive a day keeps the doctor away. If it makes the day super relaxed, everything's really chilled out and slow. But, again, back to this multiple dive thing over multiple days can certainly cause you issues. Well, mate, thank you very much. We've gone for nearly 2 hours. Let me ask you one more question, because I know on all of the Facebook posts, you've talked about long hoses, which has been done to death. You've talked about DPVs and torque, which I thought was really interesting as well. But the one that stood out to me that was really different was the way that you configured your open circuit cylinders for trimix diving. which was different to the way that I was taught to do it, where I've got trimix in my primary side mount cylinders and my stage or deco cylinders are mounted underneath those. But I think if I read it right, the description you had was that you had your trimix and your deco gases the other way around. I'm really interested to understand a bit more about that because, as I said, it is so different from the way that I was taught to do it.
Yeah, I think that very often a lot of the skills and procedures that people take into side mount diving are just copied directly over from back mount diving, but that doesn't necessarily make the most sense. You change your equipment configuration, so maybe you need to change your protocols, your skills, your procedures, and everything else. So when I started doing mixed gas dives on side mount open circuit, and I have to say I haven't done that much deep mixed gas open circuit side mount dives because, to be honest, if I'm doing mixed gas diving, I'd rather use a rebreather. Mm-hmm. So I'd rather go closed circuit. So that, again, changes things. But my philosophy with open circuit mixed gas side mount is that I have my trimix in my stages and not in my side mount tanks. And there's a number of reasons for that. The first and most obvious reason is that you spend a lot more time when you're doing mixed gas dives in relatively shallow water than you do when you're at depth. So actually having a breathable mixture, I mean, particularly when you're dealing with hypoxic gases, having a breathable mixture in your primary cylinders when you first hit the water at the beginning of the dive and at the end of the dive, I think is important from a safety point of view, because we tend to revert back to instinctive reactions and everything else in stressful situations or if we're under time pressure and everything. I mean, typically if I was doing a deep mixed gas open circuit side mount dive, it'd be in the ocean, it'd be off a boat. I would have my stage bottles hanging over the side of the boat on a gear line, and I'm just jumping in with my side mount cylinders on. And typically they contain my shallow deco gas and intermediate gas, both of which are breathable at the surface. They are also plumbed into my wing and my dry suit if I'm wearing a dry suit. So, you know, I'm not having to think about additional cylinders. And then as I put the stages on, they're containing my deep mix. But I'm very clear that as I'm descending down, I'm going to have to make a transition from my shallow mix to my deep mix. So now I'm going to my trimix as I go down, which for me is very much like doing stage dives in the cave, for example. So the procedure is very simple. It's very straightforward. And then once I've actually used all my trimix gas at depth and I'm coming back up again, and now I don't need it anymore, then I can clip it to the line and shoot it up the SMB line or hand it off to a safety diver and get rid of it. So now I'm finishing the dive again with my nitrous gas in my side mount tanks. So it has much less effect on my buoyancy, on my trim throughout the dive, both at the beginning and at the end, because I don't have to worry about the tanks becoming super light or super buoyant. I've already got rid of the trimix gas, which you could butt clip it, but it's oftentimes easier just to fire up a line or hand it off to a safety diver. So I just end up pretty much diving with my side mount tank. So I'm starting to dive with that core equipment configuration, which is very simple, which I'm very used to. I add on the extra bits that I need to take me to that next level. So if I'm diving at 20 meters, I'm just using my side mount tank. Now I want to go down to 40 meters, I add a stage bottle. If I'm going to 60 meters, that stage bottle is going to have some helium in it, basically. Mm-hmm. So none of my procedures actually change at all. And that helps a lot. And also just rigging the trimix cylinders, it makes a lot of sense because it helps to keep the trimix cylinders under control. Because typically, particularly if you've got a high percentage helium mix in your stage cylinder, then it's going to be buoyant, but it's underneath your side mount cylinders. So it's super comfortable. You don't have to worry about the tank floating up, or if you're using them as side mount cylinders, that they're sort of like really getting butt light, they're floating up, they're affecting your trim. And meanwhile, your stages are hanging down because they're heavy. No, they just sort of sample together really, really nicely. So for me, there's so many advantages and really no disadvantages at all.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about that from the point of view of normoxic. Normally I dive with my two side mount cylinders, let's say with an 1835 or something similar in it, and then have a 50 on my left and 100 on my right as deco cylinders.
No, an O2 cylinder is always a separate cylinder for me.
But did you say you butt mount that or something?
Yeah. Unless you can drop it, if it's a cave, then you can usually clip it to the line somewhere.
Sure.
If it's a descent onto a wreck, there might be a shot line, you clip it off. Or if you want to carry it with you, then you could butt mount it or leash it. Or you can carry it as a stage, but I'm reluctant to do that because you could always switch to it by accident. and it's in the way of trimix cylinders and everything else. But I would never, ever put O2 in the side mount cylinders.
No, that makes sense to me.
It would depend on the dive you're doing and the depth profiles and everything else. But again, if the dive gets longer, if it gets deeper, you can just keep adding additional stages of trimix. And your core configuration never changes. It stays exactly the same. And one of my issues is that I hate having to change my configuration around.
Yeah.
I hate having to add things that I don't normally use. So nothing about the configuration changes at all. I'm diving my normal side mount setup with nitrox in my side mount tanks, and then I would add whatever stages I needed to do the dive. So it might be normoxic trimix. I might have a normoxic trimix. I have a hypoxic trimix. I may have 2 or 3 different trimixes depending on, the depth profile of the dive and everything else. The oxygen cylinder would be butt mounted basically.
Yeah.
And it's a super comfortable, super easy way to dive. And again, it comes back to that KISS principle, and less is more. Yeah,
exactly.
Why have trimix in your side mount cylinders? And I'm not talking about normoxic trimix, that changes the game slightly. But why have a hypoxic trimix in your side mount cylinders that you can't use for the majority of the dive?
Sure.
Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Normoxic, you can breathe to the surface, right? So that's not a problem. But as you say, if you've got a hypoxic mix, certainly not. So, I get it. I just found it so interesting because it was a different way of looking at it, and there was a lot of logic behind it. The other thing that I guess might change the game a little bit is if your side mount cylinders were steels and you were using aluminium deco cylinders, that might change. Well, let me ask that question. Would that change your philosophy if you were diving steels?
Every time you change your equipment configuration or you change the environment you're diving in, or even the gases you're breathing, that can lead to a change in procedure. So you just brought up the point about diving on normoxic trimix. I would have no problem putting normoxic trimix in my side mount tank because I know I can breathe them all the way through to the surface or down to a depth at which I'm going to change over to my deep trimix. This was specifically a configuration for hypoxic trimix. Yeah. So what's the reason to use steel cylinders? Usually it's about gas capacity, right? That you need greater volumes of gas. To be honest, in that case, if I'm saying I just can't get enough gas in aluminium cylinders or in my stages to do this dive effectively, and I need to upgrade to steel cylinders, well, a better option would be a rebreather.
Yeah. For the diving I do, the other reason for steels is just really weight and having a balanced rig. So it's really talking about if I'm diving saltwater in particular.
Let me answer this question anyway. Honestly, it's not something that I would typically do because as the dives get deeper, then I would switch to rebreather because I think that's a far better option.
Yeah.
And obviously nowadays with side mount rebreathers, that would be my go-to option as well. Side mount rebreathers for deep, like hypoxic trimix diving. But let's say that you're in a cold water environment, you're wearing a dry suit with thick undergarments and you need extra ballast, then steel cylinder makes complete sense. And I would be quite happy to put a normoxic trimix in those and dive those, all the way down, all the way up, and just have some stages with some deco gas if I needed it.
Yep.
If I was doing a hypoxic dive, then same thing. I would probably still use the steel cylinders. I would be happy to put normoxic travel mix and deco mix in them, or nitrox, depending on dive profile and everything else. But my stages would be hypoxic trimix. Yep. Because how long are you spending at depth? How much gas do you really need for that portion of the dive? You use far more gas during the intermediate deco and the shallow deco than you do on the bottom typically for a dive. So you typically don't need huge gas volumes. And the other thing as well is that if you have any kind of problem, you're basically heading to the surface. If you have a problem, you're bailing out, you're heading to the surface. You can ditch all of your other cylinders, all of your hypoxic trimix. You can't use it anymore. It's not useful to you. I mean, okay, apart from low PO2 break during an extended deco, there's usually ways around that. Anyway, you've got some like transition mix or deep travel mix that will be fairly low PO2. But you've still got your gas that's going to get you all the way to the surface with you, and you've still got the steel cylinders, which are giving you your ballast that make your weighting and everything else important. So it's also the question of, if I have to bail out, if I have to make a decision about getting rid of stuff, what do I want to get rid of? I want to get rid of the gas I can't breathe anymore.
Yes.
And I want to make that easy to do. And if those are your side mount cylinders, you can't do it. You're married to them throughout the entire dive. Whereas if you have like a normoxic trimix in your side mount cylinders, steel or aluminium, or if you have your shallow deco gas or your surface gas in your side mount cylinders, whether steel or aluminium, then you can keep those, and you want to keep those throughout the ascent and the remaining portion of the dive, and everything else you could get rid of to declutter yourself and to make things simpler and easier for you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Steve. It's been really great to catch up. One last question before we go is, so what do you got planned for the future right now? So obviously diving is out for the moment. What are you doing now?
It is. So at the moment, I'm in London. I am in the process of remodeling my mum's house. She's getting on a bit. So she just needs to have some sort of mobility aids put in. So I'm in the process of doing her bathroom at the moment. I'm going to be heading back to Mexico probably September time. I'm actually heading over to Switzerland at the end of August to give a presentation at a dive show over there. For the future, what I want to be doing is I actually want to be traveling and speaking more, doing seminars and workshops and talks and things. And I was supposed to do one earlier this year out in China, but unfortunately with the current situation, that had cancelled. Hopefully that, once things get more back to normal, I'll be heading over to China to actually attend a dive show and do a presentation at that. And so if anyone out there would like me to travel and give a presentation, do a workshop, I'm happy to do so. I have a lot more time to do that now.
And still a lot to share too, huh?
Enjoying doing that. Yeah, and I enjoy sharing it, I mean, although I'm not diving anymore, I do have over 30 years of diving experience to draw on, and I still enjoy being an educator and everything else. The other thing I'm working on at the moment is I'm actually working on a book.
I was about to say, that was my suggestion for you.
Yeah, and many people have suggested that over the years. And to be honest, while I was still diving, I was too busy. But now I'm not. Then it's time to just maybe put some of this stuff down in writing. So working on a book. We'll see how that goes. Let's see if anyone wants to read it. Yeah, those projects are keeping me fairly busy at the moment.
Do you have a title yet?
I do, but I don't want to. I don't want to release.
Fair enough. Yeah. Keep your powder dry. All right. In fact, there it is. There's your title.
That would be a good one. It's not that. It would be a good one.
Keep that as a backup. My gift to you, mate.
Thank you very much. That's a great title for a rebreather book.
Exactly. Well, hey, Steve, great to catch up, and thanks so much for sharing. It worried me when I was reaching out to you because I know you've been sharing your story a lot, and sometimes you wonder whether you get sick of doing that and we're sick of asking the same questions, but it is a great story to relate, and I think there's a lot of lessons in there, especially for those of us who are getting a little older and who are dive professionals. I think there's certainly some lessons there in terms of managing your body and making sure that you can look after yourself. And then I never get tired of the stories. That Dan's Cave one is awesome. So thanks very much for sharing that. It was great to catch up. I hope we can meet in person sometime, and all the best.
Steve, it was real fun talking to you, and I can't dive anymore, but I still do enjoy talking about it. And if any of my experiences can help other people, I'm really happy for that as well. So yeah, it's been fun to do. And as I said, if anyone out there would like me to attend a dive show, give a seminar, presentation, workshop, happy to do that. New Zealand, Australia, wherever it happens to be.
What's the best way to reach out to you?
Via email, steve@gosidemount.com, or via Facebook, via Messenger on Facebook.
Okay. I'll post both of those in the podcast notes, so no worries. All right. Well, thanks very much, Steve. We'll catch you soon.
Thanks, Steve. Good talking with you. Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did making it. It was great to catch up with Steve, and just phenomenal to delve into the depth of experience and knowledge that Steve can share with us. I really enjoyed learning from Steve about how to build experience, how to build a platform, the importance of buoyancy control and stability in diving, and then how to deal with an incident once one happens. That was just phenomenal. And the story of his connection of Dan and Ralph's Caves is just a stellar example of diving at the very, very highest level. Thanks again to Steve for sharing. Thanks so much to XDeep for their support. And thank you to all of our patrons for your support of Speaking Side Mount. It makes everything possible, and I'm extremely appreciative. We'll catch you in the next episode 57, where Steve and I discuss his DCS incidents, what he's learned from it, and what we could all learn from his experiences. Thanks again, and catch you in the next episode. You've been listening to Speaking Side Mount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Side Mount.